human, we are animals, we crave the ability to be we. I know it's called me undies. We undies might have sounded differently, right?
Is it a disco now?
Yeah, it's the after party, so it's now we go with the flash.
My goal in life is to be a laptop sticker.
Me too.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.
It's a great honor, Mr. Jaffe. It's always nice to be with you.
I'm so happy to be with you. I'm honored.
Thanks for doing this, too. It's a real service to the community.
Thank you for doing this, Joseph, for doing CoronaTV in general. And it's your gift to the universe, and it's appreciated.
Very human, and I like that.
Look at you! You are insane!
How did I do that?
You're insane!
I have a number for you. That number is 2,977. And I'm wondering how many people on the Facebook feed right now can tell me what that number is. It's not US deaths, Mark. I mean, it is US deaths, but actually the people that make up these deaths were not just US citizens. They were not just Americans. They, in fact, were people from many, many different countries and nationalities. That number is the number of people that perished on 9/11, just under 3,000 people. And I did not include the hijackers in that number, of course. We're most likely going to eclipse that number this week. We're gonna blow that number away, unfortunately. Indeed, we've been talking about a scenario now, a best case scenario or a good case scenario of 100,000 deaths in the US.
So I thought I would go backwards, back in time to March 30th. That was on March 30th, and it was either later that day or on March 31st. In fact, that we went beyond, we broke that record in terms of number of, in terms of comparing COVID to 9/11. Just as an interesting statistic, right now, with all the people that have perished and passed away in COVID, would be the equivalent of 64 consecutive 9/11s, back to back to back to back, 64, 2 months of 9/11s. It doesn't change what happened. It doesn't change the pain. It doesn't make us feel any differently towards 9/11. In fact, we don't. We all think about what happened. We all think about where we were that day 19 years ago. On the flip side, we've almost become numb to what's been happening here. And, you know, I struggled being able to contextualize and be able to determine to what degree I should dial up or dial down the ability to remember 9/11. And what I've realized throughout my life is, you know, death is death, loss is loss. No one is better off, no one is worse off when you lose someone. But I do hope, though, that as we remember what happened in 9/11 and say never again, we can also find the ability to connect back to what is happening around us, almost become the new normal to the point where we've become numb. So I did want to share those thoughts with you and begin on I think, an understandably a bit more of a solemn note, because today is National Day of Service and Remembrance Day, or Patriot Day, and it is a time, you know, to remember the memories of those we lost. So let's get into the show. Next week, this is your sneak preview. This is going to be Jamal Mashburn take 4. He canceled twice, I canceled once, but I'm always optimistic and hopeful that finally Jamal will be on the show. And then we've got Brittany Hodak, Jeffrey Hazlett, Bob Wellheim, and Eric Coleman. Great branding from Eric. You'll see how he's branded himself and blazed the trail for himself. So a lot of good stuff to look forward to next week. But today, I am looking forward to, like you cannot believe, to talk with Murray Nossel. And we're going to talk about storytelling, but we're going to talk about listening as well, in context of and how it is connected and interconnected, and in fact how much, you know, storytelling and listening are one and the same. beautiful, amazing uniques coming from Murray. A bunch of birthdays, a whole bunch of people I actually went to school with. So I won't say how old Cindy Meltz or Tamara Collison are turning, except to say that we all went to school together, and I'm turning 50 this year. So I won't give away their ages at all. But happy birthday to you guys, and of course to people on LinkedIn, in particular the one and only Dave Morgan. Well, let's get into the seated soliloquy. And of course, the seated soliloquy is connected to and has to do with my guest, my VIP guest as well. But just to mention, he's actually here, by the way, because you know, my mom is now the chief booker. She's now in charge of getting guests on the show. Try saying no to your mother. In this case, I'm glad I said yes to her, because as I went down the Murray Nossel rabbit hole, I just wanted more and more and more. And yes, Bob, an amazing lineup for next week as well. And hello to you, Steve Rubin. But yeah, let's get into the seated soliloquy. Over the course of the past several months on CoronaTV, I've been told time and time again what a great listener I am, how well I listen to my guests. But truth be told, I feel like a fraud. I think I'm a terrible listener, or at least I was before my wife gave me some tough love very early on into my initial interviews. Stop talking so much. Your questions go on for too long. You make it all about yourself. You need to listen more. Of course, she was right. And so it is her, of course, that should take all the credit for me being a good listener. My journey since has been marvelous. I love listening. And even though I'm a one-man band, you know, hitting all the buttons and banners and camera angles and integrating audience comments, which can be somewhat distracting, I do try and pay attention intently to my guest. One of my techniques is actually not to have questions, pre-prepared questions, because I want to form my next question based on what my guest actually had to say. That's what makes this so much fun. I don't know what they're going to say in advance, or perhaps maybe I think I know what they're going to say, and then right at the end, they throw in a mind-blowing mental bomb, which forces me to do one of those handbrake turns and go in a completely unanticipated, different, new, or unexpected direction. I feel like we can all be better listeners. And I suspect my guest today would agree with that statement and submit that he too is on a similar journey. One thing we can all do is to force ourselves to take ourselves out of a listening situation. And what I mean by that is resist the urge to begin formulating what we're going to say or ask next while the person in question is actually doing the talking. Perhaps we can even take a few moments of silence after a speaker concludes to pause, slow down, and give the consideration it deserves to listen a question as opposed to ask a question. And for once, not make it about ourselves. Well, those are my thoughts. Now you're going to hear his thoughts. And I thought maybe the best way to bring him on is to show a little video clip. But before I do that, let me bring him on. So, Mr. Murray Nossel, Dr. Nossel, welcome to the show.
Oh, sorry. I was just busy on my cell phone. So I wasn't listening to a word you were saying.
Of
so
course
that incidentally, one of the things that I have to deal with every time I go into a corporation is that while I'm talking, people are on their cell phones. That was just my little joke. And that is one of the most disturbing things for a speaker. You know, you're standing in front of a room and you're looking at people who are on their mobile phones, and it's broad daylight and you can see them, and they think that you can't see them on their mobile phones. Somehow they think they're invisible, and they have no idea the impact that they're actually having on you, the talker. Because when you're standing in front of a room talking to people, you're relying on their listening for your speaking. If you don't have their listening, then your speaking actually has nowhere to land. It has nowhere to go. So, so anyway, my little joke was just to be on my mobile phone when you switched to me. But of course, I was listening, and I was listening to you, Joseph, and I was finding you so entertaining and so amusing. And even though you said that this might be a little more of a solemn occasion, there's something about your way of being and your self-irony which is so infectious that, in fact, I became a little more self-ironic too, and I kind of really enjoyed that. So that also shows you how your speaking created my listening, and now my listening is creating your speaking, because somehow you've learned a little bit more about me now and about how I maybe listen. And so you also learned that I may just trick you once or twice based on my trick. And so you know about me and I know about you. And this is how we are developing a reciprocal relationship right now. Your listening is creating my telling, and my telling is creating your listening. And also because I know your mother from way back when, and I suspect she may be listening. Her listening is somewhere there for me. It's like, oh, she's listening. So her listening is shaping my telling too. Even though I can't see her and she's far away, it makes no difference. That's shaping the way that I'm speaking right now. So in that way, I just want to sort of emphasize the fact that listening is constitutive. It shapes what we say. It's not a passive it's not a passive act. It's an active act.
It is, and you know what? And it's funny because I've spent a lot of time on the show, talking about, we've spoken about public speaking and storytelling and stage fright. I don't get stage fright. In fact, I almost want to. I have no fear. I'm almost overconfident in a room filled with 1,400 people, but on a Zoom call or a conference room with 3 people, I'm an absolute wreck. And when I know that my wife is in the room, my friend is in the room, my mother is in the room, the stakes seem to be so much higher, because you really want to not just impress, but connect with that person who has that personal connection with you.
Yes, very much so. And you see, what comes there is a listening context, okay? There's a context. So when you know that person, you come with a sort of set of assumptions, but you also come with a background of relatedness. And that background of relatedness shapes the way that you listen. So I know that you wanted to play the video, and I think maybe I described this on the video, Joseph. So if you want to do that, then you'll spare me the necessity of having to do it now, but otherwise I'd be happy to explain.
No, I love it. I mean, this is the South African in you, which is you come onto my show, you hijack the show, and I love it because we're cut from the same cloth, and it's exactly what I would do. And you're like, why don't you play the video now? And now I'm thinking to myself, by the way, should I still play the video, because he's kind of set it up beautifully, and I don't want to be so predictable and state. But you know what? I'm going to play the video because it shows you in action, and you are mighty fine when you are in action. So let me do that for you now, and let's just see if I can make that work. There we go.
I would really like to acknowledge all of you for being here, for your interest in storytelling, and for your curiosity about what it takes to rewrite a story. The topic of my talk today is the change you want to see in the world begins with your own story. But on reflection, I was thinking that really it should have been a longer title. And the longer title should have been, The Change You Want to See in the World Begins with Your Own Story, and someone or someones who are willing to listen to it. Because without anybody's listening, your story has no air to breathe in. So you, sitting there, out there, and by that I mean every single one of you, is currently the air that my speaking is breathing in.
Well, I'm gonna bring us back to it now and tell you that your story has air. Most people, unfortunately, in life are full of hot air, but your story has my air, which hopefully is not hot air. And I would love to hear your story. And then we can address what you actually said in the video, which is recognizing that you know, I mean, it's such a profound idea that if you, the change, you know, I mean, you're going to say it better than me, right? Which is the change that you seek. If you want to change the world, it begins with your story, but it's not good enough. Someone has to want to hear your story. And I want you to define that a little bit shortly. What does it mean, someone who wants to hear it? What if they don't want to hear it? What if you need to tell them a story and they're closed to the story? But before we get there, let's just go back to South African days and tell us your story and how you came to be here today with me today, and how, you know, your journey took you towards becoming a master storyteller and listener at that.
Okay. Well, how I come to be here with you today at this moment in time, i.e. Joseph Jaffe, is because I met your mother probably 35 years ago. And so, or maybe even longer than that. And so there was a connection that was formed there between the two of us that caused us both to remember one another. And she suggested to you that you be in touch with me. And so what we get there really is that, in a sense, a story is like a, I want to say like a virus, but I don't mean virus in a bad way or a noxious way. I mean that it's something that mutates, and something that when you have the origin of a story and you have a meeting, for instance, you have no idea where that's going to go. You have no idea. It's kind of like you said about your show earlier on. You know, we don't know where it's going to go. And for me, that's the most exciting kind of show. Like, I have no idea where it's going to go, because we are currently in this game of listening and telling. And it's dynamic and it's alive. So yes, I came to the United States in 1990, and I wanted to be a playwright. And in South Africa, I had been a clinical psychologist. And I wanted to, the stories that I heard as a clinical psychologist were so fascinating to me that somehow I wanted to share those stories on stage. So I did that for a while. While I was getting my green card, I performed monologues on stage in little East Village venues, and I put on some plays. I actually got well reviewed, but I didn't make writing plays. And so I had to go back to university again. And this time I decided to do social work, a Ph.D. in social work, because I had done psychology, which was very much about the individual relationship, but I was very interested in the relationships that exist inside a community, inside a culture. And I was very interested in what's subsequently become known as movement building. Like, how do you build a movement? And I don't think that it's too difficult for us to see the connection between listening and movement building, right? Because if you're going to tell a story that's going to be inspirational and that's going to create a movement, you've got to have, people have got to be willing to listen to you. And not only are they listening to you, but they're going to others and they're sharing the story, your story, with others who are listening. And so it goes on, you know, that ripple that I was talking about. Started with your mom. Here we are. Who knows who's listening right now? Where's this ripple going to go? We don't know. So anyhow, I arrive in New York. I'm now doing my PhD in social work. And I've met a guy in 1993. And I've become involved with him. And it turns out that he is HIV positive. And in 1993, HIV and AIDS is pretty much a death sentence because there were no medications yet. So as part of my PhD in social work, I have to get a job somewhere. And they say to me, well, what would you like to do as part of your internship? And I say, anything as long as it has nothing to do with AIDS. It's just terrifying. I'm a gay man. I'm involved with someone who's HIV positive. I can't do that. And that's what happened. That's exactly how I got my job in AIDS services. And all of a sudden, I was working with people who were dying. And, you know, I tried to do what I'd been taught as a psychologist to help them understand themselves, you know, and get in touch with their you know, the meaning that they were making out of having AIDS. And they, you know, one of my clients got incredibly angry with me. She said, what are you talking about? What does it mean for me to have AIDS? Can't you see what's going on in this program? We're dying. Every one of us dies, will be dead a week or 2 or 3 from now. This is why we're in this program. Your job is to help us come to terms with the fact that we're dying. And you asking me, you know, how I feel and what does this mean? So I went to my supervisor. Incidentally, this was in the basement of the building in Brooklyn, and the supervisor was chain smoking, no windows. And he said to me, Murray, look, you're not a clinical psychologist anymore. You're a social worker now, and your job is to help these patients come to terms with the fact that they're dying. Now, Joseph, I want to just connect this to something you were saying earlier about, you know, the fatigue that we have about listening. And the number of dead, 9/11 number of dead, Corona number of dead. As a gay man who arrived in 1990 into New York City, I was dealing with the number of dead due to HIV, due to AIDS, right? And these numbers were climbing, you know, and there were statistics and, you know, and the numbers were mentioned again and again, and it became very fatiguing. You just didn't want to listen to it anymore. There was nothing you could do about it. There was no cure. And it just was like, oh, do we have to hear about this again? In fact, when I went home to South Africa and performed a storytelling performance that I've done for many years at the Baxter Theatre, one of the journalists came and said, oh, don't tell me you're talking about AIDS again. We've all got AIDS, speak fatigue. She actually used those words, right? So there I am working in this AIDS program. And yes, what's so terrifying about it is that the patients are dying. And I have to face that every single day. And I have to face the fact that I'm going home to David, who is alive and well to this very day, and I'm now married to him and been with him for 27 years. And I have to face those same fears. Yes, yes, it's a miracle. But I have to face those same fears. So ultimately, we are dealing with something that's of a spiritual nature here, right? Because working with those patients, you knew that they were going to be dead. So what could I do with them? What could I do that was useful? And what I saw was that when people died, their belongings got packed into these black garbage bags, and no one came to claim those bags. So people knew that when they died, they would be forgotten. So those living knew that they would not have any kind of, no one in the future to remember them. So I realized that we can't take anything with us, right? All the material possessions we can't take with us. My lovely house here, my truck outside, all of that, I can't take anything with me. The only thing that I can truly leave behind that will be remembered is my story. And that's what I did with these AIDS patients. I just taught them how to tell their stories. I imparted what I'd learned as a playwright. However, there was a problem. If I am in the storytelling group, and I conducted the storytelling sessions as a group, and I'm saying something that's frightening to the other members of the group, their listening shuts down. And as I explained earlier, listening, is necessary for speaking. Listening is like a bowl, and speaking is like liquid poured into the bowl. So just as the bowl gives the liquid its shape, so listening gives telling its shape. Well, if the people in my storytelling group couldn't listen to one another, then there would be no speaking. So I had to teach people first and foremost how to listen. How to listen openly, without judgment, without interpretation, without any kind of interruption, just so that the people telling their stories could say what happened to them. And that, for me, is the crucial sort of ground rule of storytelling. For me, is simply saying what happened. So there we have the reciprocal relationship between listening and telling. One woman once came into my listening and storytelling group and said to me, "Murray, you're onto something very big here." And she was pretty much right. My listening and storytelling method became big, in the way that my father was big as a pharmaceutical executive. And all of a sudden I was traveling all around the world, teaching people how to listen and tell stories. And at this moment in time, I would say that right now, to bring us right into the moment, the very subject matter of your show here, which is Corona, the onset of Corona has changed my career. Firstly, I can't go traveling anymore all around. Secondly, my business has dwindled significantly because I'm in front of live audiences and working in corporations. But most importantly, I would say, Corona has reminded me of what I learned in the AIDS epidemic. And that is the necessity of confronting our mortality and the fact that we are all impermanent and going to die. And that I'm going back, in a sense, to a more spiritual connection to listening and storytelling at the moment. It's a wonderful background you've got there of the fire and people sitting around the fire. Because I want more of this. I want more of what we're doing right now. I'm not so interested any longer in standing in front of, the largest social media companies in the world, yammering away around how storytelling brings empathy, when they're all then going off and selling information, unethically to others. In that sense, listening and storytelling become a kind of a checking off a box of all the cool things that you're supposed to do, and it's not coming from a very genuine place. So I'm returning to that very thing that you've got there on your screen. So
that's beautiful. And let me tell you, the warmth of the fire doesn't hold a candle to the warmth I'm getting from you. And I love what you're saying, because this idea of our mortality, it's also a reality check and perspective. And truly, when all is said and done, the only thing that matters, there are a few things of meaning that matter, but our health has to be right up there. And all the bullshit and the money and the superficiality and the materialism, and as you say, kind of talking about how we can sell more effectively to people, we suddenly take stock and we think, is there a better way? That doesn't mean we can't make money, and it doesn't mean we won't make money, but there's a better way. And I just want to give something I read on your website that I just loved. You said therapy was irrelevant, but listening, he discovered, had a healing capacity. It wasn't until I read that I actually finally understood the power of therapy and being able to, I would always think of the idea of going to a shrink that just sits there and listens to you and makes you do all the talking. When I was younger, when I was more immature, I'd be like, these guys are frauds because I'm doing all the talking, I'm doing all the work. All they're doing is just listening. And then asking me questions, more questions. And now I get it, thanks to you.
So what do you get? I'm interested. I'm curious.
Well, what I will do is I will turn this into the part of the show, because part of what I do here is we go from extremely solemn and serious and intense to frivolous, you know, and because that represents the manic depressiveness of our roller coaster lives. But this is where I find a quote, and then I ask my guests if they can tell me who said this particular quote. So your quote is, "The purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon."
Yeah.
And by the way, do you have any idea who said this? And the answer should be, I don't have a friggin' clue, because you're not meant to.
I don't have a clue, a friggin' clue.
All right. Well, this was Brandon Sanderson, fantasy and science fiction writer. But I love the quote because, in a way, it took therapy. It took storytelling. It took, you know, I suddenly realized that what was going on, and to answer your question, there was active listening going on, but ultimately the ability to focus that conversation on hearing my story, or maybe me being able to figure out my own story and be able to tell it differently to the people that I care about.
Yes. Well, I think what's crucial in that, Joseph, is that we are in it together, right? So if, you know, I was trained to be a psychotherapist. I was trained as a clinical psychologist in Cape Town at Valkenburg Hospital, right? And the way that I was trained was that I was the expert and the patient was this kind of helpless person who needed my expertise. And my expertise was based on a system of understanding psychopathology. So I come in there with a psychopathological lens, and all I'm trying to do when I'm listening to the patient is diagnosing them and seeing how the things that they say fit my diagnostic box. Well, I don't know whether that actually makes anybody better, you know, and what the hell does even therapeutic mean in this context, you know? And so for me, what I'm always going for, although I've learned other languages for describing it now, is a sense of connection and aliveness between myself and anyone that I'm talking to, and that we are in a process of discovery together. Now, all of us human beings are wounded in some way. We're all wounded, and we need healing, and some people need more healing than others, just as some people are more wounded than others. And to think of yourself as a therapist as separate from the person that you're with is to be operating from a power dynamic that I don't think is very helpful. So I just come back to this reciprocal relationship between listening and telling. The listener isn't doing nothing, but how the listener is listening is really important. Because if you're listening to diagnose, if you're looking to pathologize, if you're listening to prove someone wrong, then you're going to be shaping their telling in ways that satisfy your particular shape of listening. So the question is, how do we listen openly? You know? Now, I want to tell you a little story, if I may.
Of course.
It was just about a month after the actual 9/11, after the planes hit the World Trade Center. And a film that I had made, I had no luck selling this film. And all of a sudden, I went to the film market in New York City at Angelica Cinema, where there used to be a big film market, the IFP film market. And within 2 days, I'd sold my film to HBO. Because it was an optimistic film. It was about a gay couple who were having a baby with a surrogate mother. The film's called Paternal Instinct, and they bought it immediately. And there was a really kind of interesting atmosphere at this film market because people were very open. You know, it was very close, the cinema, in fact, to where the World Trade Centers had actually been. And we were all so stunned by it, and nobody knew what to make of it. A little bit like now. Anyway, Sheila Nevins, who was the head of HBO documentaries, was otherwise known as the Documatrix. That's how famous she was as the ultimate documentary executive producer. And she was in a panel discussion, and someone said to her, "So Sheila, how are you relating to what's happened to 9/11? What's your response to 9/11? And you know what she said? She said, "I don't know. I'm just listening." That's what she said. "I'm just listening." Well, of course, it's so difficult to do that because you have to face all the pain, all the uncertainty, just as we're having to do now. So listening takes a tremendous amount of confidence and courage. And that was her actual response at that point.
I love that. And, you know, part of, again, this journey with Corona TV has been to become more secure and at peace with silence, with the ability to say, I don't know the answer, rather than trying to fake it till you make it. But the ability also to say, I'm just listening. We would have looked at that response as a sign of weakness, as someone who doesn't have an opinion, who's not going to give us, espouse their pearls of wisdom. But the ability to just say, I'm just listening. And quite frankly, and I know you will agree with this, it's probably what most companies should have done, you know, instead of rushing with advertising about we're in this together with COVID or Black Lives Matter. They should have just said, you know what, we're just listening. We're taking a pause. We're taking it in. We're listening. We're learning. We'll get back to you.
That's such a beautiful point. That's really such a beautiful point. Because yes, it turns into it's instantaneously commodified, or putting it another way, it's a reaction rather than a response. And in order for us to respond to something with intelligence and with wisdom and with care, we need to be able to listen. But react is which exactly what we did. United States did. I mean, you know, 9/11, and then we had to retaliate to show our strength. You see, rather than just stepping back and saying, why did these people bomb the United States? Why did they go to this effort to attack the World Trade Centers in New York? And I'm not saying not to do anything about it. What I'm saying is to really inquire, why did they do this? What's going on in the world that people are feeling this way about the United States? That takes courage. That takes real strength.
That's beautifully articulated. It actually, you know, it brings something else that you had said, which is the moment we ask the question, why story, why now, we catalyze the brain's natural hardwiring for storytelling. Don't underestimate the power of that question. And I think just the ability to say, why did this happen, versus just the gut reaction without the thinking, you know, the fire ready aim, quite literally. And maybe as a result of doing that, we didn't get any answers, or at least the answers that we got were not necessarily the correct ones, because we weren't asking not only the right question, we weren't asking any questions.
Yes. Yes. And the other thing is that we created ripples, right? Consequences that were way beyond anything we could ever have imagined. Look at the fallacy of the weapons of mass destruction that was invented out of fear. And the war that went on for so long, and the destruction that's happened as a result of that, right? These were the ripples. These were the consequences of not properly understanding what you're dealing with. And the minute you just jump in, you know, and you don't truly take in, as a white man, what does Black Lives Matter mean, right? And I don't have an answer to that. I really do have to listen to people who are Black telling me stories about their lives, and then maybe I'll just have a little bit more of an inkling about what that means. But to jump into any kind of conclusion that I know what that means is sort of arrogance and ignorance, basically. And it comes from a failure or a failure or a lack of willingness to listen.
Now, I want to ask you about false narratives, or how listening can be a part of, or how listening should be, let's say, woven into a different kind of a storytelling, where we're not just passive vessels being fed narratives or content. But I just want to acknowledge a few people out there. David Libby said, "Bravo, Joseph." Wow. By the way, when they say that, they're referring to my guest, obviously, which I would agree. Seth says, "Listening is at such conflict with what we're conditioned for, to be first, to have an opinion, to tell it to the world." Tom, who's our resident philosopher, is saying many smart things, but he's listening. And Chris Brogan is here. Chris is one of my fellow brothers, streamies. He has an amazing show, and we acknowledge and listen to each other's show, and he's on at 10 a.m. Every day, and he loves this idea of why story, why now. Heidi Furman is in Cape Town, and she said response instead of react. So people are listening, and people are learning as well from you. Now I'd like to kind of go back to that idea, which is there's asking questions, and then there's questioning askers. So how do we, you know, in a world where we are fed narratives and where stories are woven around us, how do we make sure that we're not just the spectator or the innocent bystander or the collateral damage?
Well, firstly, listen out for what happened. Okay. Now, what happened is the answer to a set of questions. What did you smell? What did you taste? What did you hear? What did you see? And what did you touch? Okay. In other words, empirical evidence. An opinion is not a fact. An interpretation is not a fact. The statement of a feeling, you know, I'm so resentful. That's not a fact either. It's not a sensory fact. So what I'm only interested in are sensory facts, things that you could see, smell, touch, taste, and hear. So that's the first thing. So the minute someone starts to throw feelings and interpretations and judgments and opinions and commentaries and editorials into what's being presented as a story, I kind of switch off. I lose my listening. And why is that? Because if I have an opinion, it's just going to arouse your opinion. We see this so much in the United States at the moment, right? Which is, you know, there's just opinions being flung around all the time. I mean, I can think of some people who are basically only espousing opinions and presenting them as facts. So then we have this whole thing about, you know, the fake news. Well, I mean, look, I don't know what to do about that, honestly. For me, that's just subverting the order of how human beings communicate. You know, if you present facts and they're verifiable with a camera or with an audio recorder, where you can smell them or taste them or touch them, then as far as I'm concerned, they exist. So having an opinion about whether they exist or not is just bullshit. I mean, about that. So, you know, we all have these internal bullshit detectors. We all know on our gut level whether what we're hearing is genuine or whether it's just some kind of bullshit. I think we all have that. We have to trust that, you know. But you also know that, you know, we deal here with very powerful listening shapers, right? So when people listen to news broadcasts, which are constantly pumping out opinions, that is shaping the way they listen to facts. So we also have to really interrogate, I think, the way we're listening and what is shaping our listening at any given moment.
I have created a couple of terms which help me visualize and internalize this. As you were talking, I called it forensic listening because it's all based on the evidence. And I think forensic listening is about, you know, using those five senses as fact-based, almost triangulation of truth.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to share that with you. And I think maybe that's an interesting, you know, segue now when you talk about bullshit detectors to, you know, the life that you and I used to lead before the world went crazy, which is talking to these brands and corporations, faceless corporations, empty vessels, and helping them to be better storytellers, more authentic storytellers. Let's not even get into the listening part. This is something that you do. It's something that narrative does. And I would love for you to maybe share a couple of insights in terms of how you help executives, corporations, brands, you know, be better listeners and storytellers, quite frankly.
I don't know that I've been so good at it, at working with the corporations, and unless they are really, the executives are really open to it. Now, I talk about one such executive in my book, which is a book about the application of listening and storytelling to business, and this guy who's an executive, a business executive at the Condé Nast publishing company, was genuinely interested in listening, genuinely interested in how he's listening, genuinely interested in how people around him are listening. And he saw this as such a necessary thing for the people who work for him. But he wasn't really doing it so that they would become better at making money. That wasn't his motivation. He was doing it as he was giving it to them as an offering, you know, as an offering, and he was seeing it in its spiritual dimension. That he was showing people that whether you're at work or whether you're at home with your family or your spouse or whatever the case may be, that this intimacy and this connectedness is possible, and even at work. So it wasn't being channeled towards, you know, we're going to become better listeners and storytellers so we can be more effective and more competitive in the marketplace. When people come to me with that particular injunction, they are much better off going to my business partner, Jerome DeRoy, who is brilliant at doing that. I couldn't be bothered, really. I couldn't be bothered unless the executives really have a genuine desire. For instance, I was working in Germany with a major energy company, you know, and the executive really wanted to share his story. It was a personal story that he wanted to share, but he got cold feet. Why? Because the other executives in this energy company, very macho company, would think that he was weak somehow or wouldn't take him seriously or whatever. And he was right at the point where he was going to give this as his keynote address, reveal something really personal about himself, which was so charming and which was so wonderful. It would have been such a wonderful sharing. Couldn't bring himself to do it because he was afraid of the judgment that was going to ensue. So when people, for me, are that handcuffed by their fears of judgment or losing money or losing their job or whatever, I can't be bothered. I really can't. So what I would say, working with companies, a few tips that I would say is that work is not separate from life. That's the first thing. When we go to work, we are still the same beings with the same need for connection. as we are everywhere else. And secondly, as you rightly said, Joseph, companies, huge corporations have an enormous ability to make a difference. And that they have the responsibility, as far as I'm concerned, to listen and to see what, and to think about the ways in which they and their products can be making a difference to the world, so that their values have to extend beyond making money. And they really need to think about the role and the place of that company in the world, in the community. And for me, if someone in a company is really willing to do that, then their story is going to be genuine and authentic.
I think that, you know, and Tom said, deep listening is a spiritual practice, and it's as hard and as worthwhile as any other such discipline. What I took away from your two pieces of advice is when you look at this transactionally, when you look at it, quite frankly, too left brain, you're going to fail, or you're going to set yourself up to fail. When you submit, and when you recognize and devote yourself to, as you call it, the movement, but to the humanity of it all, and the responsibility, that's very powerful. And I think that I would love for you to, you know, as I could talk to you for hours, and we're going to go next door to you know, our virtual campfire, I should call it, our Zoom room shortly, so that people can interact with you and ask you some questions. I know that Jan, who's one of our regulars, is always asking great questions, such as, for example, is it the storyteller's job to gain the attention away from the phone, which we can leave to the Zoom room? But I would love for you, to, that's my tease, right? I would love for you to talk a little bit about one of your important projects right now, and where a lot of your, I think, attention is focused, which is the World Mother Storytelling Project. And of course, you know, we'll talk about Mothers Rising as well.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to say one thing. I hope I can come back again, and next time I would just want to listen to your story, Joseph. You know, I'd like to work with you on and extract your story from you, excavate and extract it. I'm fascinated to hear how you got here at this moment. So just to let you know, I'd love to have that reciprocal opportunity.
Yeah, right now my mother's typing an email to you, so just watch out. We'll have to remove her from the story, because she's a big part of the story. We're talking about, you know, the word mother. How can I not think about my own one when I see that in yours? But as there's no question, but as you said, it's the ability to understand a story is not static. A story is not one way. It is as dynamic and timeless, you know, and that's why, again, the word movement. We can think about Black Lives Matter as movement in terms of a movement. It's not a, it's not just a community. It's a dynamic movement, but it's also just movement, physical, literal movement. People marching, people moving themselves, people being moved. The word move is such an important part of it. But please tell us a little bit about the World Mothers Storytelling Project, and why mothers.
Like many things that I've done, the origin of the World Mother Storytelling Project is my personal life. And really what happened was that in 2006, my parents were carjacked and held hostage in Johannesburg for 3.5 hours. And they had every intention of killing my parents. But my mother managed, while in the car and at gunpoint, my mother managed to make a connection with the carjackers. So much so that she was able to persuade them not to kill her and my father, and they were eventually driven to safety. Now, people, you know, sort of commented, and this is a much longer story than I'll tell now, but people commented afterwards, wow, Murray, your mother sounds absolutely amazing. How incredible it would have been to have such a mother. And I said, well, you know, quite frankly, I was like many, you know, white, upper middle class South African kids. I was raised by my nanny. really. And my mother was a concert pianist, and she was practicing or playing or teaching piano to students. And I didn't really know my mother that well. I didn't feel like she didn't feel that present to me, really. And so after this carjacking, I went back to South Africa, and I spent 3 weeks just listening to my mother, really for the first time, just listening. Even sitting in on the music lessons that she was giving, to really observe her. And I realized there's something not only about my mother, but also about myself, that there was a kind of a transformation that occurred in my relationship with her, when I was able to see really who she was as a person outside of who she is as my mother, and all the assumptions, expectations, etc., that I might have had about her as a mother. And it was so powerful, this experience, that I really had this epiphany. And the epiphany was, the world needs this. The world needs mother stories right now. I don't need to tell you, who has a mother who's extraordinarily resilient and powerful person. What are the knowledges that mothers have that are being written out of the record, right? And are not allowing, or are not given the kind of airspace that they need in our society. So the mission of the World Mother Storytelling movement is to teach children, all of us, to teach all of us how to listen to and retell our mothers' stories, not only so they can be passed down the generations, but also that they can be disseminated through our society and hopefully influence the society in ways that are beneficial and healing. So this project is being presented along with the Town Hall of New York. The Town Hall of New York City is a venerated institution. It was established by the suffragettes in 1921. And it's a highly democratic venue, which was originally intended for New Yorkers to come and discuss issues of the day. And it's still very much like that. It's a 1,600-seat theater, and many luminary artists like Glenn Gould, Nina Simone, Judy Collins, they've all performed at the Town Hall of New York. And Town Hall just embraced the World Mother Storytelling Project and said, let's do it there. Of course, I was supposed to be doing it live on stage, but there have been 2 virtual events. People can find those events on YouTube. The one was called World Mother Live, which was our inaugural program. And then the other's called World Mother Pride, which was LGBTQ World Mother. But the one that's coming up on October 25th is called Mothers Rising. And this is about mothers who have taken personal loss and tragedy and have turned it into a service for others. And I'm looking at the moment, I'm talking to 2 African-American mothers in Los Angeles, both of whom lost their kids due to gun violence, and who are actively engaged in their communities, going into prisons, creating community action, really showing people the tragic effect of gun violence. Like you said, it only takes one, right? You said that earlier. So, yes, you can have all those numbers and that statistics regarding gun violence, but to hear one mother's story about how she lost her son to gun violence, So this is what Mothers Rising is about. It's not only mothers who have triumphed by serving others due to gun violence and police brutality. I've got a woman, an incredible person, Hedy Schleifer, who is a master relationship builder. And she tells a story of a tragedy that happened to her in the Amazon jungle, and how she didn't want to live anymore after that tragedy, but something in her told her she had to make a difference in the lives of others. Now, I feel like if we can galvanize all these mothers' stories and show how resilient mothers can be, how much wisdom, how much love, how much tenderness, how much strength they have, and we put those stories into the world, we can change the world. So that's, I'm an evangelist. What can I tell you? This is my story, true belief.
Amen. And you know what? It's at times like these when we are wounded when we have pain, that we naturally want one thing, and that's our mothers. And it is a role that, as a father myself, I can do whatever I want until I go blue in the face, but I will never be a mother. And I get it. Murray, this has been just an absolute pleasure and a privilege. I'm so glad the ripple finally extended to us, even though we are actually physically quite close, being in the same state. I look forward to being at one of your events in person. I look forward to meeting you in person. And we're going to head, I guess, next door to the Zoom after show. But just a final word on a beautiful day where we think about the memories and the stories and the mothers of the mothers that were left behind, the mothers that were lost. Just final word to you, Murray.
Well, my final word is to thank you so much for this opportunity and for your open listening, for your willingness to just engage in a conversation with me. It's been so valuable for me. And, you know, every iteration of a story or, you know, even sharing about the World Mother Project, saying it, speaking it into your listening and to the listening of these wonderful guests who also shared, it helps me to refine my own ideas and my own thinking. It helps me to reshape my listening of myself. And you have given me that gift today, and I really am grateful. And I think you're doing a wonderful thing. And I would like to acknowledge also your tremendous warm heart and your tremendous intelligence.
Well, you know, I take it and I deflect it straight back to you, because this was a gift that we both got to share. We're going to head over to the Zoom after show, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you, Murray.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you for watching Corona TV with your host, multiple author and global keynote speaker, Joseph Jaffe. Corona TV is the show about hope, positivity, optimism, and if there's time left over, a little bit of marketing. The after show on Zoom starts right now at bit.ly/Corona TV After Show. If you like the show, tell a friend or two. Please subscribe to the show at coronatv.show. And if you want to get inside news, previews of upcoming guests, and much more, text Corona TV to 66866 or visit josephjaffe.com/subscribe to sign up for the show's newsletter.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.